Okay, hi everybody, and welcome once again to the Popular Music Books in Process series, a joint project of IASPM US, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the POP Conference. I'm Carl Wilson, one of the series organizers, along with Eric Weisbart and Kimberly Mack. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, and get on the mailing list by contacting Eric. You can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including last week's amazing talk with Aline Braxton and Mark Katz about their book in progress, Rap and Redemption on Death Row. Next week, we'll have two writers talking about the Canadian independent music boom of the 2000s, with Michael Barkley on his forthcoming book, Hearts on Fire, 6 Years That Changed Canadian Music, and Melody Lau on her upcoming book on Tegan and Sarah. A little program note there. Unfortunately, Jessica Hopper, who was going to mediate their discussion, had to drop out due to a scheduling issue, but we're happy to say that instead we have the musician Owen Pallett stepping in to join them from the point of view of an artist who came up in that period and appears in Michael's book. Today, though, we're excited to bring you a discussion between four authors in Bloomsbury's 33 and a third book series, kind of continuing what's may be a bit of a tradition in the PIMBIP canon now. This time indicating the ways that the series is continuing to diversify its content, including new sub-series designated for Brazil and Europe. We have Derrais Carter's work in progress on Marvin Gaye's I Want You, Ginger Dellenbaugh on Maria Callas in the newly published Lyric and Coloratura Arias, Richard Elliot on Lisbon DJ music in the forthcoming DJs de Guetto, and Daniel B. Sharp on the recent Naná Vasconcelos Saudades. I don't really know how to pronounce that word, somewhere in that range. Quick bios. These are a little out of order because Derrais is actually going to go last, but I have him in the first in this list here because that was alphabetical. So Derrais Carter is a creative writer, artist, and assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona who writes and thinks about Black culture. Along with his Marvin Gaye book, he is the editor of Black Revelry in honor of the Sugar Shack, forthcoming in January, which brings writers, visual artists, dancers, and a DJ together to celebrate the Ernie Barnes painting, The Sugar Shack. Ginger Dellenbaugh is a music historian, singer, and composer currently completing a PhD in music history at Yale. Since 2014, she has been a part-time lecturer in the contemporary music department of Eugene Lang College at the New School, New York. She lives in Vienna and in New York. Richard Elliot is senior lecturer in music at Newcastle University, whose previous books include Fado and the Place of Longing in 2010, Nina Simone in 2013, The Late Voice in 2015, and The Sound of Nonsense in 2018. Daniel B. Sharp is an associate professor jointly appointed in music and Latin American studies at Tulane University. His first book in 2014 was called Between Nostalgia and Apocalypse, Popular Music and the Staging of Brazil. He's currently writing up a project on performances at the Music Box Village, an experimental sonic sculpture garden and outdoor venue in New Orleans. As always, during their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat. In the last part of the session, Kim will use them to call on you for the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversations and encourage our presenters to keep their eyes out of the chat and on each other. So now with no further ado, all of you, please take it away.
Right, you think I'd be used to Zoom by this point. Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute there. Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here and to open up this panel with these wonderful writers. I really enjoyed reading the samples you sent around. Thank you. I'm going to actually be really brief. I know some people have a little more in depth to say about their work, and I want to make sure we leave time for that. I guess I'll just hit the most obvious thing on the head, why this is an unusual book for this series. Well, it's about opera, and it's the first traditional classical music book in this series of 160 books. I can't quite say whether I haven't read all 160 of them, so I can't say if it doesn't overlap with some others that think about the voice. But one of my challenges came from the original pitch. Like, how do I make this fit into this, what would ostensibly seem like a square peg into a round hole? And some of this also has to do with just the nature of opera as being something kind of, well, as I address in the book, something very distant, very elite, probably something that people feel intimidated by going to, and the whole approach to it. And how do I learn to like something like this? So I think the approach to the book was really like, how do I actually write a book that's not about its two main characters, which are opera and Maria Callas? So there have been a lot of books written about Maria Callas. I mean, so many that it's nuts. Like if you want to read one, there are plenty of them that will give you every single nitty gritty about her life and the scandals, some of them better than others, some of them more in depth than others. And about opera, the same. So one of those shelves back, or like many of those shelves back there are dedicated to books on opera. But I was thinking, like, how do I think about this through a lens of this particular album? Now, this particular album came on the heels of probably what is considered one of the most famous recordings of opera ever to be done, and that was Tosca at La Scala in 1953 with Maria Callas and Tito Gobbi. So that is kind of the definitive Callas opera recording. This, on the other hand, is more akin to a lot of the things in the series, in that it's really like an album. So from the concert format, collected arias brought together in an album format, and how they all fit together. So in the book, I use each aria as a way to kind of get at almost like a weird syllabus, like to get at different aspects of popular culture that are dealing with Maria Callas, aspects of vocalization, and what I think of as the sort of uncounted labor of singing. As a singer myself, having trained for many years and actually like thrown it away because I didn't want to do that. Singing itself is rather a boring process. So it's really, it's repetitive. It's an athletic process. It's a highly, because the instrument is here inside, it's a highly metaphorical process. Vocal pedagogy is notorious for having weird metaphors associated with it. And at the same time, it's highly acculturated. There are certain forms you want to fit into as an opera singer. It's about smoothing out individualities of the voice. And yet Callas sort of came out with a lot of individualities in her voice that I wanted to kind of track back down through my own practice. So for those of you who've had a chance to dive into the book, you'll read that there's a lot of like stuff about the face and the throat, some of it which may be more interesting to you than others. I hope some of it came across to at least give you that there is a real tactile, visceral, conscious process going into the singing to kind of demystify the whole process of demystify the mystification of this recording and Callas in general as this sort of portal for the voice, and what happens to a lot of singers, the idea that singing is a gift, the whole mystique of talent, which is in itself problematic. And then I got to talk about a lot of things like Star Trek that I wanted to kind of shoehorn in there. So that actually was not so brief, but I will stop there and hand it off to the next presenter to talk a little bit about their books. And I look forward to any kind of questions you might have about this.
Thanks, Ginger. I think the way we're going to do this is each of us is just going to speak a little bit on our own books, and then we'll ask each other a few questions before opening up to Q&A later on. I think I'm probably going to be a little bit longer than Ginger, probably around about the 10-minute mark. So I want to just say something about the album that I'm writing about, but also about the book itself. So my book is about a compilation album called DJs do Guetto. And I'll explain what that is for about 5 minutes or so, and then afterwards a few minutes on the book itself and what I was trying to do with the book. So DJs do Guetto is sometimes, I'll refer to that possibly as DJDG, if just as an easier abbreviation, is a collection of 37 tracks released in 2006 by 6 young Lisbon-based DJs: DJ Nervoso, DJ Encapa, DJ Marfox, DJ Fufusho, DJ Jesse, and DJ Pausas. DJs do Guetto was the name of the DJ crew as well as the compilation. So all of them had grown up or been based in social neighborhoods on the outskirts of Lisbon, designated by themselves and by others as ghettos. The compilation was uploaded to the web in September 2006, and links were sent out by the group so that people could download it for free. It was collected together into CD-length folders to make it easy for burning to CDRs, but most people would have been probably playing it on MP3 players. So this collection took the DJs from local renown in their neighborhoods to wider fame in the dance music scene of Lisbon and beyond. It was an early taster of a sound that would come to be known as batida, from the Portuguese for beat, and that combined international variants of house and techno with Afro-Portuguese styles such as kuduro, tarraxinha, funaná, and kizomba. And the musicians making batida are mostly, not exclusively, first or second generation immigrants from Portugal's former colonies, especially Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde, and São Tomé e Príncipe. The music is influenced and seen as an evolution of the EDM music that was coming out of those countries, especially the kuduro and tarraxinha of Angola. And like kuduro, this is contemporary music created on digital audio workstations, such as FL Studio. So in the years following the release of DJ DG, these sounds would become ever more familiar on dance floors around the world as Marfox particularly and other DJs established batida as Lisbon's hottest new musical export, taking it from the rooms and the streets of the projects to trendy metropolitan nightclubs and musical festival stages. For all its influence on the local batida scene, DJs de Guetto might have disappeared from wider awareness had it not been reissued by the Lisbon-based record label Príncipe Discos in 2013. In a fitting echo of the original release, Príncipe reissued the 37 tracks as free digital downloads, and unlike the majority of their releases, they did not give the album a physical release, meaning that it's always existed as a digital artifact. So Príncipe published an extensive set of liner notes with the reissue, highlighting the historical importance of the music for the contemporary Afro-Portuguese dance music scene, the intensity of its sound, and the precocity of its creators. They also recognized the strangeness and futurity of the sounds. And I'm just going to read a little bit from those liner notes to give a sense of how they were describing them in 2013. The precision and care with the sound is impressive, they write. Millimetrically controlled in order to maximize the brutality of rhythm in any set of speakers. It is rhythm that is the essence of these compositions and the element that is all transforming. Alarm sirens, horror movie keyboards, kalimbas, cut-up voices, which are mutilated and cut up again. Ranging in vibe and territory through universalist epics, works of pure percussive and amelodical austerity, or grinding attacks that might provoke dizzy spells and cardiac problems, there's a clear feeling here of wanting to create a music for your friends, but also for a planet that is as yet untraveled, end of quote. So this is as good a description as any, I think, of the music that Príncipe, the record label, has been publishing for the last 10 years, when the label put out in 2011 an EP of DJ Marfox's music as its inaugural release. And the description gets at the precise and rhythm-heavy, fragmentary but coherent nature of the batida sound, as well as highlighting the tropes of strangeness and futurity that would feature in critics' responses to the music. So that's something about the album itself. I just want to say a few things about the book and why I was interested in covering this book for 33 1/3. Several reasons, I guess, but I'll mention 4 in particular. So this book is an entry in the 33 1/3 Europe series. So in considering an entry on Portuguese music, I guess it might have been expected that I or another author might go for Portugal's most famous musical export, fado. This is an area that I've published in before, and there are countless classic albums within or adjacent to the genre that would make great entries in the series. I happen to know that there's a title on the great Amalia Rodriguez being prepared, for example, one that I expect will sit brilliantly alongside Ginger's book on Maria Callas. There's also a canon of great Portuguese pop, rock, and folk albums that would yield fascinating studies and would further 33 1/3 Global's aim to expand the series from its historic Anglo-American core. So I briefly considered the trajectory of the pop rock field in Portugal in one of the chapters of my 2010 book on Fado, and I'd have been happy to explore this area further. However, there was a whole stream of Portuguese music that I neglected in that chapter, and which I had become increasingly aware of and drawn to in the years since writing my Fado book. So this was music being made by the first and second generation immigrant communities that I've just mentioned, musicians who, for the most part, want to assert their identity as Portuguese artists, while also drawing on Luso-African legacies. At the same time, this music was becoming more visible and audible outside of Portugal as the second decade of the 21st century progressed. So I felt then that there would be an opportunity here to challenge what might be understood as Portuguese popular music. The second reason, or second thing I wanted to do with the book, was to follow a continuity with my work on Fado, which was the relationship between music and place, how music genres get mapped onto and come to speak for particular places. In this case, particular neighborhoods of the city of Lisbon. So where I attended closely, and perhaps too closely, to the downtown areas of Lisbon that are hymned in Fado songs previously, I wanted here to consider batida as a sound of the suburbs and to think about how musical segregation was mapped onto geographical segregation. The third reason for wanting to write about this compilation, as might be clear from my description of Derrais do Guetto, there are interesting things that it can tell us, I think, about the status of the album in the 21st century. So this collection of 37 tracks has had a tenuous life as a standalone album object, and I wanted to explore that sense of fragility that digital culture encourages, while also trying to protect against it, I suppose. And fourthly, I was also thinking of batida as an example of global pop and of what some were starting to call world music 2.0 during the era in which the music was gaining larger audiences. So there was a parallel and interconnected evolution of the batida genre and the theorization of world music 2.0. And I started exploring both of these in my teaching over the last 10 years or so. For example, in the global pop module that I run at Newcastle University, and in contributions that I've been making to other Newcastle modules on world musics. So I wanted to also work up some of that stuff that was happening in the classroom into this book as well. So there's some of the strands that I try to weave together in the book, but all the time returning to this uncertain object that is Derrais do Guetto. So I'll stop there and hand on to Dan, who I believe is going to speak next.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. I am going to share my screen to... Oh, wait.
That looked fine from here for what it's worth.
Yeah, I think I forgot to share the sound.
Okay.
That was why. Okay, it should be good now. All right, excellent. So over 5 decades, the Afro-Brazilian percussionist Naná Vasconcelos recorded nearly 40 of his own records and participated in at least 240 of those of others, and that's not including several documentary and film soundtracks. He won Best the best percussionist in the Downbeat magazine critics poll every year from 1983 to 1991, and had 9 Grammy Awards. And what first inspired me to learn more about Naná was really that in my mind I had considered 1960s to 1980s jazz, psychedelia, world music, experimentalism, and post-punk to all possess, despite crossovers, that they all possessed largely discrete genre histories. And here was a figure that had really gracefully navigated and made his mark on all of the above, right? His collaborations were the results of his travels living in Recife, Rio de Janeiro, New York City, and Paris. And that's 6 years in Paris and 20 years in New York City. And I found that this story provides links between scenes and genres, and that's why I really want people to learn about him, even if they haven't heard. It's one of those examples of, even if you haven't heard the name, you've likely heard something that he's done, before you open up the book. So even though the 1979 album Saudades on ECM Records, it has the format, if not the form, of a concerto, with Naná as a berimbau soloist engaging in a musical dialogue with an orchestra. But I don't think of it as a matter of really arguing that, hey, contemporary art music should be part of this series too. Rather, what I was thinking about is that in order to make sense of Naná's work, you have to move between no wave, mambo, mangi beat, tropicalia, ECM jazz, John Hassell and Brian Eno's Fourth World Possible Musics, Don Cherry's concept of organic music, that he didn't necessarily consider jazz, but would say that jazz was the glue. And that's, so if we just look at some of, starting in Brazil, all of these different figures that, their fans didn't necessarily get along with each other at the time, but Naná was playing with all of them. And some of his best memories were from the organic music theater days in the early 70s with Don Cherry. He made he really had an explosive musical chemistry with Egberto Gismonti, and his band Cadona with Don Cherry and Colin Walcott on either side of 1980 made 3, I think, important albums. Part of the Fourth World Possible Musics record, and then worked in both the 80s and the 90s with Arto Lindsay, both in Ambitious Lovers and then the really great 90s and early 2000s Arto Lindsay solo records. Pat Metheny, and then all sorts of examples, like when Arto and Laurie Anderson did a tribute to Carmen Miranda in New York City, Naná was the musical director. So there are all sorts, I argue that he inspired Seu Jorge's character in The Life Aquatic. It's just, he shows up in, there's a documentary about, mostly about John Zorn and Sonic Youth, but Naná is there as well. The Fishing with John, Tom Waits episode, Naná is in the soundtrack, right? Like he did part of the soundtrack for the Al Pacino movie Cruising as well. So all sorts of examples. And the cinematic and theatrical aspects of painting with sound are part of his story as well. He came of age performing in bossa nova-based activist music theater, and then shared a loft with the revolutionary filmmaker Glauber Rocha in New York City in 1971, and actually a lot of Naná's extended techniques on Dellenbaugh really took shape in that loft that he was sharing with Glauber Rocha, as Rocha was usually working naked, trying to get a Marlon Brando film up and running that never happened. So I use Naná's album Saudades as an anchor as I trace how he accumulated extended techniques and navigated umpteen musical genre boundaries. And throughout, there are two parallel shifts that I see accompanying his story, two principal parallel shifts. And one is technical and the other socio-political. So between 1964 and 1979, Naná established himself on three continents just as the advent of hi-fi, stereo, headphones, electronic instruments, and multi-track recording deeply transformed music production. And the soundstage model of recording, as Dockeray and Moore put it, of simulating musicians on a stage when you're in the recording studio, was giving way to the sound box, where the stereo field became a multi-track playground. And Naná's microphone choreography and experimentation with Foley artistry and wordless vocals really allowed him, I argue, to bridge these competing models of recording. And in the midst of these technological shifts, there were the fundamental geopolitical shifts of critical post-colonial perspectives from the global South becoming more audible in Europe and North America. So in the midst of this, Naná used sound to work to counter dehumanizing notions of the primitive and the civilized. So playing the berimbau, an instrument that, as you can see in the slide, looks like a bow and arrow with a gourd attached. Naná was using a single string, a gourd, a stone, a wire, a stick, and a wicker basket filled with dried beans, and was making music that he would argue was as complex and sophisticated as the ARP synthesizers that were in vogue at the time. So for Naná, being heard and being acknowledged were one and the same. Being audible within the stereo field correlated with being socially recognized and valued. And he went to great lengths to do more than just what he would call play shiki, shiki, shiki for big pop stars. And I would argue that he really transformed the possibilities of percussion and expanded the role of the percussionist in the process. So my goal for the book was to hear as many voices as I could, and I talked to over 25 of his collaborators, each telling a bit of the story. Throughout Naná's life, he really worked to reorder the boundaries between traditional, commercial, popular, and contemporary art music, between music, sound, and noise, and between Afrological and Eurological approaches to music making. And so I have just a few seconds to just put into your ears a little bit of the sound of this record. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, good times. Should I jump right on in? All right, cool. Hey, everybody. Derrais like Paris. I'll play a few seconds of something, and then I'm going to read a bit from my drafted intro. There's been a shift or two in terms of perspective, but I'm down to talk about that when we start chopping it up. All right. Can you hear the audio? Nothing? All right, let's try one more time. I was just sitting here nodding to myself, really feeling it. Okay. I'll restart Spotify real quick. Despite the brief window of time that I spent in a choir in middle school, I will not attempt to sing anything. I damn sure won't attempt to sing any Marvin Gaye to you all. In an ideal situation, I will confess to you all, wonderful group of relative strangers, that if I could, I would be reading this paper laying on my side. If you all haven't seen it, there is a video of Marvin Gaye on YouTube. I believe it's from when he was in Ostend, and his band is playing in the studio, and he's just casually laying, like, propped up. But the way that this Wi-Fi is set up in my accommodation, it's not gonna let us be great. All right, I'm gonna try this music one more time.
Heard it for a second, then it went away.
Hey, well, that's fine. I like to think that the FBI agent who monitors me regularly plays around with my internet connection such that I can't be great. But that's fine, everybody. I'm just gonna jump into some of this paper, all right? I want you. You have to say the words aloud and let them fall on your ears to really hold them. That 3-word spill, that declaration, admission even, confirms what you feel so intimately. 3 monosyllables voice the urgency of your longing, and in that moment of proclamation, that tense, bracing sensation gripping your sternum and maybe your thigh, we'll call it vulnerability, is only relieved afterward in the exhale. In 1976, Marvin Gaye gave us permission to linger in our overflowing want. He gifted us I Want You, an album that is as lusty and dreamy as he is, an album rooted in the sway of the grind, an album that lets us eavesdrop on the romance between Marvin Gaye and Janice Hunter, a relationship forged during Gaye's marriage to Anna Gordy. We know Marvin Gaye as a complicated soul man with church roots and sex appeal. However, in I Want You, he morphs into a sonic exhibitionist. Even if you don't identify as one, for 37 minutes and 43 seconds, you became a voyeur. This book-length exploration of Gaye's 14th studio album explores how he sounds desire and brings us into his fantastic vision of love and lust. Throughout the book, we delight in the ways his honeyed voice makes a number of pleas, demands, and promises to Jan, all while the layered multi-track vocals encapsulate us all. So it was important to me that this book will work on you, much like Gaye's album does. At times, I discuss his contemporaries in order to situate, us in a particular historical moment, but the book is truly a dive into the album's emotional registers. In this way, Audre Lorde's essay Uses of the Erotic and LaMonda Horton Stallings' book Funk the Erotic move us through this sensual terrain. I Want You is instigated by an encounter between Gaye and Janice Hunter during a recording session for 1973's Let's Get It On. Let's began as a religious ode turned political statement, or would-be political statement. It was meant to be a message song for people to get together. Rumor has it, Gaye was in the studio trying to record the political iteration of the song, and none of the takes landed successfully. But the session producer, Ed Townsend, was visited by his then girlfriend, Barbara Hunter, and her daughter, Jan, was a high school student. This is really, for me, a source of deep contention throughout the book. In the last few months, I've been struggling, not struggling, it's kind of easy, but also like trying to figure out how to write with a subject that I'm so deeply critical of, especially given his relationship to Janice Hunter. Like, that shit was rough. Okay. So back to the draft. When Jan enters the studio, Marvin's energy shifts. On the next take, he freestyles that iconic wail, "I've been really trying, baby." For the next few years, Gaye and Hunter build a life together. They have 2 children, and aside from a live recording in 1904, Gaye at the time had no interest in making another album. Meanwhile, Berry Gordy impatiently waited for Marvin to get back in the studio. He couldn't afford to not check on other Motown artists, one of them being producer and songwriter Leon Ware. In '75, Ware was collaborating with author T-Boy Ross on an album of his own. And when Gordy heard a draft of Ware's song, I Want You, he jumped at the opportunity to buy it for Gaye. Leon Ware agreed. And upon hearing the track, Marvin was ready to work the following day. When Marvin and Leon got in the studio together, Leon played a few more tracks off the album, which prompted Marvin to strike a deal. If you give this to me, you can produce my whole album. The two had instant chemistry. Marvin had a voice I wanted, Ware remembers, and this, I think, added to the synchronicity between the two. It wasn't a competition, it was a collaboration. They recorded a portion of the album in Motown's LA studio before moving to Gaye's new Sunset Boulevard studio, known as Marvin's Room. David Ritz describes the layout. It was built according to Marvin's design. The security was tight, the decorations slick, with earth-toned carpets, dramatic wooden walls, and plush furniture, in addition to a spacious control room and a studio large enough to contain Marvin's 18-piece band during rehearsals. There were 2 reception areas, and upstairs, accessible only through a single heavily locked door, a loft bedroom, and a one-way window looking into the studio below. The centerpieces were Marvin's custom-made king-size waterbed and jacuzzi big enough to accommodate a dozen consenting adults. If the interior decor was any indication of how the album might sound, then I Want You's lush landscape feels right. And still somehow the design seems literal, like it was merely the foundation for a greater aspiration. And if this is true, then one has to wonder what fantasies were to be erected here and how would Marvin and Leon get us there? I Want You is a sensual album described as, quote, an invitation for Marvin to enter a world of uninhibited sexual fantasy. And before we hear that world, the invitation is also extended to us through the album cover. I Want You doesn't feature a photo or likeness of Gaye. Instead, it presents us with a painting featuring a bar full of Black folk dancing. Give a second and I'll show you all the image here. All right, can you all see that? All right, dig in. They bend and bow, tactile, fleshy, eyes closed, limbs stretched, mouths twisted tight and agape. If you stare long enough, you can hear the moans and you can hear the shouts. They gyrate, they sweat, they reach inward, skyward, and somehow towards each other. Some search, some have long been found. This is the scene. This is where the fantasy plays out. This is the Sugar Shack. Sugar Shack is painted from the memory and imagination of football player turned artist Ernie Barnes. The oil on canvas painting stands in for a physical likeness of Gaye. The sweetness of an encounter, the perfumes and pheromones gets us. We join the raucous party, ear hustling through every track on the album for those moments of improvised privacy forged between lovers amidst an effervescent crowd. Throughout the book, especially in chapter 2, I'll offer an extended meditation on Sugar Shack's relationship to Gaye. It matters to me that Jan's mother brought Gaye to Barnes' studio in the 70s and introduced the artist to the singer. And while many people familiar with the painting probably refer to the original version made in the early 70s or the one that appears in the Good Times credits, I think there's much to be said for how Barnes revises the painting so that it speaks directly to Gaye's album. For instance, he adds a banner to the top right corner that reads featuring Marvin Gaye with his new hit, I Want You. For this reason, I examine the ways that Barnes's painterly style, dubbed by critics as neo-mannerist, employs warm colors juxtaposed with brown skin and wooden structures that visually mimic the textures of Gaye's desire for Jan and perhaps at times our desire for one another. This is not to be thought and argued, it's to be felt. I Want You is a sensual album fueled by cocaine, fantasy, a God complex, funk, sensation, and soul. Adherence to the will of those words is the price of admission. The bass, strings, and congas keep us afloat as Gaye immerses us into his own fantastical world. All right, so there's one little part towards the end that I want to read, and then we can stop. Critical reception of I Want You was lukewarm. Comparisons to Aretha Franklin, Willie Hutch, Smokey Robinson, Donna Summer, Barry White, and Bobby Womack make it difficult to ascertain what critics wanted from Gaye. Some critics were more pointed. One for the Tri-State Defender from Memphis, Tennessee, wrote that the album, quote, sounds like Marvin's plodding around out there trying to find his way back home, unquote. The paper added insult to injury by claiming that the album's only distinctive feature was its cover. Rolling Stone reviewer Vince Elliott, clearly unimpressed by Gaye's offering, complained, quote, as pillow talk, this is entirely too limp. And in spite of the presence of several tracks of a woman's delighted sighs and moans, the action here isn't much more than attractive but unenthusiastic foreplay. There's no fire here, only a well-concealed pilot light. These critiques nourish my assessment of the album. Not interested in answering Gaye's perceived missteps, rather I'm suggesting that maybe past critics weren't sure how to access it. In 1981, when Gaye performed at London's Apollo Theatre, writer Carol Phillips lamented, block quote from Phillips, here was a Motown artist whose finest recording suggested both a hard political edge and a great personal sensitivity. Yet on stage in London, he seemed content to strut around and present himself as little more than Mr. Sex Machine. I had waited a long time to see my hero, and my sense of disappointment was profound. A belief in the power of love seemed to have given way to a simplistic desire to be loved. The Marvin Gaye whom I was presented with not only lacked sensitivity, he lacked subtlety. If I could imagine the stage of London's Apollo Theatre to be an American auction block, then this Marvin Gaye would have fetched top dollar. Phillips's encounter with Gaye left him unsettled. He sees in Marvin a loss of awareness, or more aptly, a critical social posture that the writer finds synonymous with what's going on. This tension explains why Phillips described I Want You as little more than a fully fledged celebration of sexual carnality. Unlike Phillips, I do not avoid the carnality of the album. I embrace it, revel in it even. After all, Marvin is the reason Frankie Beverly sang naked in his studio. As much as I adore Marvin's saccharine sweet duets with Diana Ross or Mary Wells or Tammy Terrell, Kim Weston, the romance projected in those songs are devoid of the bodiness which lets us know that the desire articulated in Ain't No Mountain High Enough is also physical. Put differently, Marvin reminds us of what will likely happen after we traverse that high-ass mountain. You need drive and endurance, not just for the journey, but also for the arrival. And I Want You, he lets us know that he will go there with us, or at least he'll try. This album is a testament to that very fact. He gives us a sonic terrain so that we can mentally and maybe in a more fleshy fashion project ourselves onto that king-size waterbed. There might be a few lines, we might roll around. Maybe you sleep, maybe you stay up all night. But this album grants us permission to honor our flesh and our fantasies. Let's go. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Derrais. So I think we're going to maybe just ask each other a few questions now before we move to the general Q&A. Shall I kick us off? Maybe, Ginger, could I just ask you a little bit about how you deal with the voice in the book? You talked a little bit about that in your introductory comments earlier on. I was struck in the chapters I read by how you bring theories of the voice in. And I just wondered, what were you trying to do with, well, maybe not what were you trying to do, but did you find it a challenge, you know, kind of bringing in theories of the voice that have been kind of worked out in various contexts and still articulate them within the limited space of a 33 and a third book, alongside also telling us something about the music that Callas is singing and her vocal art?
Right. Well, I'll answer that kind of briefly. I'm actually really jealous of, I mean, Dan, your book, you got to write so much. I don't know why they limited us to like 33,000 words. You know, I had more to say. I don't know if maybe I should have written the Brazil series. So that was a roundabout way to say, Richard, I actually wasn't able to address as much theory about the voice as I wanted to. And yet at the same time, I also this isn't a book for sound studies scholars or voice scholars. So I wanted to at least, there was some stuff I felt obligated to talk about, simply most of the stuff that I kind of had problems with. So in the chapter where I talk about opera and death and all these dying women, there's been a lot written about that. And of course, one of the most famous books is Michel Poisat's The Angel's Cry, which is all about the ecstasy of the voice, kind of like Lacanian take on like how the voice transforms us, how we're feeling when I'm really oversimplifying it here. But one of the things that really pissed me off about this book was that there's just shit all about singers in here. Like there's nothing about the bodies producing the sound and the actual strain and how complicated it is to create this, what he's describes as this sublime moment that we're all striving to hear, and what that feels like on the other side. So a lot of the work in the book is about simply shifting things back to a singer's perspective and thinking about working bodies. And I hope that some of the way I'm thinking about this could also explode this to help think about moments of transformative vocalization, not just for opera singers, but in all kinds of vocal expression across genres, gender expressions, and other borders, so that we can start thinking about that it's always a two-way street of the performer listening and performing and the listener listening. And it's just not all about the consuming ear. It was my problem with Bart. Then I end up talking about like my own screwed ear. So, you know, but yes, so I was reluctant to talk about Roland Barthes because that damn grain of the voice just is thrown around everywhere. Like it makes sense, right? And it doesn't make sense. Like, what the fuck? What's the grain of the ear? What's the grain of the voice? And everyone talks about it like they know what it means, but no one really, like, you could ask someone, you're like, what is that? You know, what? I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to curse on this. It's being recorded. Okay, but I was thinking about it like he was onto something. I think he just, it gets used in a bad way. And that's why I wanted to address it. Like, it's not self-explanatory. And I think the Poisat in the same way. So thanks for that question, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates actually, what you're saying about Barthes there. I mean, I happen to love that essay, but of course it is problematic. And it also, where is the grain as well? You know, no one's ever been able to find it. But I think it's getting interrogated a bit more these days. Certainly some of the recent stuff I've read around voice seems to be taking Barthes to task a little bit more. But also what you say about Poisat, there's a book I've tried to use in my own work in firstly writing about Fado and then later writing about Nina Simone. And yeah, everything you're saying there about it being sort of quite abstract and really needing to be brought to life. So I felt that worked really well. I thought you combined those things very well. And I like the way that each chapter is a sort of capsule of sort of, you know, a bit of history about a song or an aria, a bit about Callas, and some theory about the voice. So to do that in a concentrated space, I think is very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, at root, I'm an historian, so I can't get around the sort of opera, the fun stuff about like cats coming on stage and stuff like that. I think it's cool when you got to know about what's going on with this, who's writing this, and how the presentation is how each aria is framed. So if I may actually ask Dan a question, may I take that over, Richard, and then pass it along? Okay. So Dan, I had a question. You pose a lot of binaries in that introductory chapter you gave us between different, like you're finding him in sort of in the cracks as how I'm, at least in that introduction, is how you're kind of framing it. And I wondered, I'm not all the way through your book, so forgive me if you actually address this, and I don't know that yet. But the artist focused on the berimbau and the use of that instrument, its exoticism. And I was wondering if you see also a kind of pull between exotica that was running rampant at this time as a kind of denuding force of taking global sounds and marketing them for a bourgeois white audience. Do you see also a form of resistance going on there between Naná's music making and this kind of, for lack of like this vampiristic kind of exotica genre?
Definitely. Yeah, there's where I think about it, it's throughout, but where I think about it the most is the chapter about his time in France. And there's a particular idea of Phil Ford's where he talks about, in his article about exotica, kind of the shift from the 50s and the early 60s to the late 60s in terms of this kind of kitschy moment in terms of exotica, and then by the late 60s and into the 70s, this countercultural notion that of wanting to almost kind of try on the identity of the other that was packaged in these earlier forms of exotica. The thing that I found, especially with his time in France in the 70s, is that there were all of these cultural gatekeepers who were interested in him in the context of the exotic being refigured. In certain cases, like the most exotica moment was a Chrysler commercial for a pseudo four-wheel drive proto Range Rover, and Naná does an incredible job. It's like exceptionally executed alienated labor, right? But it was really interesting to me to see how a lot of the same musical ingredients were treated in a more kind of solemn, spiritual, and utopian frame in his record Africa Deus, but were caricatured by the Chrysler commercial. And then there are other examples, like the film my French isn't very good, but Les Naufragés de l'Île de la Tortue. It's a 1974 French film where he is hired by a travel agent who is selling to tourists a shipwreck experience. And he is hired to play berimbau on the deck of the ship to kind of accompany their packaged, Robinson Crusoe-like experience. And that's the film where it feels pretty clear to me that Seu Jorge's character in The Life Aquatic is inspired by that. So that would be a case where the filmmaker was aware of the exotic aspects of the berimbau, but was turning it so that the fact that the tourists, were ignoring him as he did this on-screen soundtrack was part of his indictment of the tourists. So it's a place where these elements of the primitive and the exotic are being refigured, and so in some cases they're just being reproduced, like the Chrysler commercial, but in other cases they are being kind of reordered, to at least to a certain extent. Derrais, I actually have a question for you. I'm very interested in the way that you think about writing style, and in particular from your the excerpt that you shared with us, there was this phrase, ekphrastic prose, and the notion that you wanted to keep the energy of the encounters alive in the reader's imagination. And so I would just love to hear about when you sit down to write and want a sense of proximity and vividness and even the visceral, like how do you think about it?
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. At night with a drink. Like that in a very like basic practical, right? It's this is a book that I knew I wanted to write at night. It's a book where I knew I wanted to cultivate a mood, because I essentially want to show up on a page like a gossipy butch queen in an archive, right? Like I'm interested in the kind of stories that might be told in the world of that painting, but I'm also not particularly invested in sounding like a Marvin Gaye authority, right? Like that's just somebody else's work, right? Fantastic. But to me, there's something so dynamic about his engagement with Ernie Barnes's painting. Earlier, I was doing like a shameless promotion of this book album that is coming out in January. That's what I'm doing in Amsterdam now, is finishing up some of the material for that. And it features writing by 6 different contributors, where I asked them to take a detail from Barnes's Sugar Shack painting and then write an ekphrastic passage. And the idea was like, I told them, don't argue. I was like, y'all, we're not arguing about shit, right? You're going to take a moment and you're going to like revel in the ways that you can use language to invite a reader into this painting. And part of that is about the words on the page, but I also asked them to pair each contribution with a song selection and a cocktail, right? So some folks are like, yeah, pair this with Chardonnay. Other folks are like, a dirty Negroni, right? And so over and over and over, I keep thinking about writing as an invitation. And as somebody who wants to have, again, like hedonist or like a Hussey's liner notes for I want you, then I want it to feel like we're sneaking into a party, right? And so I'm like, a happy hour can do it sometimes. Spritz hour is cute, but at night, right? Curl up in bed, get your weighted blanket, right? Like I'm laid up in bed like the Queen of Sheba, like just kind of typing away. But those are the moments where I feel most like, I'm about to be immersed in the world of the Sugar Shack, right? And so for me, like description does such fantastic and compelling work. And so I'm trying to use this book, right, to experiment with a really richly descriptive voice. So yeah.
Excellent. I like that idea of purposefully not arguing, but reveling. Right.
Thanks. And my hope is that when the book, I'll tell you, I'm going to confess this, okay, on the internet. COVID has made it really difficult for me to write for months, right? Like I struggled, continued to struggle with writing, but also grief. Grief does a lot. And so there have been a number of breaks throughout the year, right? And just spending time being with family. And so I'm finally at a point where I feel like I can approach the manuscript again after weeks of essentially like not even being able to listen to the album, right? I went from every week, like jumping back in, drafting some stuff, to having these large breaks where I was like, oh, this isn't happening. And so it's only now that I feel like, okay, I'm coming up for a little bit of air. and I can walk down the street and listen to this album, and then something, stands out, and I'm like, oh shit, it's not even Marvin anymore, but I'm back in the painting, right? Like there are moments on the album when it's not even Marvin and Jan anymore. It's two people in Durham, North Carolina, which is where this painting is based on Black folks dancing at the Durham Armory, right? And so for me, it's just like this imaginative landscape where it's like, yeah, sure, there are other parts in the book where I talk shit about Marvin for, going after and having a relationship with this girl, right, who was a high school student when they met. And then there are these other moments where it's like, oh, Marvin can't even reach the level of intensity that I imagine Big Daddy Rucker, who's the singer on stage in the Sugar Shack that night, clad in a red suit. Marvin can't even match that intensity, right? Like he'll never arch his back the way the Big Daddy Rucker arches his back, right? And so in those moments, like I want us to play there, right? We're thinking about the bending, the bowing, we're sweating. Like I want us to be a little bit warmer when we leave that book. And so for me, an argument ain't gonna do it. Argument might piss you off, but the argument gonna like make you turn and put on a Quiet Storm playlist? Maybe sometimes. I don't know how y'all set your lives up, right? But for me, like I want a writing style that kind of invites that kind of engagement. So that's what I'm trying to instigate.
Excellent, thank you.
Ginger, I got a question for you. Okay, so going through what you said to us, I was like, I don't know shit about opera. This is fantastic. I'm also really nosy, like a close read, and it's because I'm nosy. And I also tend to over listen. And I love a malapropism. And so with your book, though, I kept wondering what seemed like the furthest reach for you, right? In terms of making connections, like you connect us to the Scream, right? In I think Psycho, but you also help us think about like performance and Maria Abramovich. But I'm wondering if there was like one moment, one text, one scenario that just felt like, you know what, this is a bridge too far, but I'm gonna throw it in the book anyway.
Oh yeah, well, be nosy, because actually I chapter, I'm forgetting my chapter numbers, where I mentioned Paula Abdul, that was in the chapter 5. So talking about what screws my own ear up and what I become fascinated with is not something I'm very comfortable talking about. It feels really intimate. I've never been a real fan of, as much as I've practiced music my whole life. I can't say I'm terribly much a fan of any particular music. And maybe that sounds like a strange thing to say, but I think if you talk to a lot of my colleagues in classical music, when you start like 3 or 4 years old, it becomes such a part of your life that the idea of being a fan or falling into the rapture of some kind of other music, letting yourself just be subsumed by it, seems kind of unprofessional in a weird way. So that confessional was hard for me, but it seemed important in the framework of writing about intimate relationships with music, because all the people I'm fighting against, not but fighting against, but then like Poisat, Bart, they're all talking about their really deep arousal when listening to opera. There's like something very tumescent about everything that they say about these swollen ears and like being their bodies. And like, I think there's this whole kind of, which is great. Like, I'm all for that. But I think it's a very one-sided story. And so I was working very much against that. However, that doesn't mean I haven't felt that at some point. So I think it felt really important to say in chapter 5, like I have actually nothing to say about this aria, because it really does. That's the one aria on the album that I feel so deeply moved by what she's doing. I could tell you I could kind of break down what she's doing, but how it makes me feel is not something that I can really explain. So admitting that was a really hard point. And I wanted to address, I know we shouldn't be looking in the chat. Is that like verboten? But okay, Kimberly's nodding. Don't look in the chat. All right, I'll be quiet.
Well, I think I mean, in terms of time, isn't it time for us to open things
yeah,
up?
Yeah.
I'm terribly curious to hear what I haven't looked at the chat yet, but
All right, yeah, why don't we start the Q&A? And so the first person who had a question, and please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. I think it's Parishka. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, yeah, Parishka is fine. Hello. Now that I've heard Ginger say all these other things, I have many more questions, but I'll stick with my original question. And I kind of framed it with a kind of abject imposter syndrome position, as, you know, sort of the first classical work in the 33 1/3 system or series. So I said, originally I said, did you feel any kind of pressure to relate the athleticism of opera to other notable athletic genres of music? I was thinking particularly of metal, because of this book being in the 33 1/3 system. But after hearing the way you talk and your confidence, I don't see, you know, abject as being kind of part of your gig.
Well,
I'm going to say interest. Did you have some?
It's all a show. This is, you know, I don't know. I will answer really quickly and briefly because that's a really great question. Athleticism, I think performative athleticism is one of the things that it usually establishes the binary between classical music and pop music. I think there's a real idea that classical forms of art making are about a certain athleticism of control of the body, of timbre, of conforming to a certain kind of performative expectation. Whereas I think now I'm going to break down this, but I'm going to say it doesn't exist in a minute, but I think that there is this idea that someone like in metal, this is an excess. This is a kind of natural expression that kind of like bursts out. Yet, that said, I think having worked with someone like Melissa Cross, who works with metal singers and trains them, there's exactly just as much form of athleticism in pop vocality as there is in classical vocalities. I think it's just a different form. There are different codes. I'm thinking of someone like Axl Rose, who has like 4 different voices that he moves through, from like high to low to deep growl to forward voicing, where you hear the entire length of the pharynx, and how he displays that or deploys it is extremely precise and really marked. And I think this would be true for probably the music that Richard is working on, for how Marvin Gaye is expressing himself, for how Naná is expressing himself through all those kind of vocalities that Naná is doing, that Dan mentions in the beginning of his, where it's forming this Doppler effect. So I think part of my book is also, I hope that we can think about this kind of athleticism in terms of other voices as well, not just operatic voices.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right, thank you for that. Eric, do you want to form a question, sort of more of a question? Eric Weisberg. You're muted.
I really should know how to unmute by now. Okay, there we go. Call it a momentary lapse. I guess what I wanted to ask each of you to comment on, maybe starting with Richard, because it was his presentation that raised it for me, was it seems that in the process of expanding the 33 1/3 series to include perspectives outside the pop rock canon, we're also stretching how we use the album. It's not necessarily the exact centerpiece in the 1950s, 1960s version of the only way to have an elongated, repeatable experience of music anymore. If we think about right back to the pop rock canon, how this weekend people spent a lot of time either watching clips of Stephen Sondheim performances or watching a Beatles documentary about making music rather than just having a Sgt. Pepper's-like experience, we can start to see some of that. So I'd love to hear from people about how the album itself, so at the core of the 33 1/3 series, is there for you in some ways, but you have to push at it in other ways because it's a sort of useful but increasingly limited maybe vessel for these kind of inquiries. So the role of the album itself in your 33 1/3 projects and how that reflects the expanding nature of the 33 1/3 series, however each of you'd like to come in on that. That was basically my sort of question, taking the theme for this week and just putting it on the table a little bit more. Sorry for the long question.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's something I was thinking of actually when I was thinking about some connections between these projects. Is exactly that thing about the role of the album. Certainly for mine, it was one of the reasons that, as I say, that I was quite keen to do this particular project. I think there's something really interesting to think about in the era of streaming and playlists and digital artifacts that aren't necessarily, brought together in a record or a CD or whatever it might be. So that was certainly part of what interested me in this. At the same time, as I sort of spend the kind of opening, at least the opening chapter, sort of describing this thing as kind of precisely as an album, really, albeit one that's always on the verge of perhaps disappearing. As MP3 files online, like one of my first footnotes points out that when the albums were reissued, one of the links that is still advertised as the place to get hold of this album certainly doesn't work for me. It may work in other countries, it may work depending on what your VPN is or whatever. But so that idea that the music is kind of there, it's become this milestone that other DJs refer back to, and yet it's always sort of on the verge of disappearing. And yet it is still this thing, and it's this thing because it gets referred back to, because it is the canonic milestone that the other DJs say was the thing that really kickstarted the scene. Because even when it was put together to be shared through eMule and torrent sites and what have you, back in 2006, it was put together in the format that would fit onto 2 CDs, and it still exists in that format. So if you go to find it on SoundCloud, for example, it says CD1 and CD2. So there's this whole kind of conceptual baggage that kind of makes it an album, even as there's nothing really to hold it together as an album. It's a series of MP3 files that were collected from various computers and put together. So yeah, I think that was certainly something I kind of wanted to think about. But for me, the album in this particular case it has this kind of tangible object-like quality, just as being the thing that gets referred to, even though it's always kind of constantly falling apart.
I could say in my case, I kind of went on a journey in that when I first imagined the book, my concept was to basically use the record as a MacGuffin, and spend the book reaching up, the 15 years, because the album really accumulates all of this really unique palette and vocabulary of extended techniques that Naná developed. And the first draft was rather thin on the actual chapter about the record, and Jason Staniak, my editor, he like sent it back to me, and he was like, "No, you need to." And it was the best advice, because I discovered, I learned so much. There were some like late nights where I was like, "Oh wait, oh what's going?" You know what I mean? Where the circumstances of the recording of the album correlated with ways in which Brazil was in the international news, and really, like, there was this whole other dimension to the record than I understood up to my first draft. And so that was my experience, that I actually was thinking that I wanted to downplay the actual album. But then I'm glad that by the end I was able to kind of do both in a way.
Would other folks like to answer?
Oh yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, so one of the things, well, a few things. First is that My ritualistic ass loves to go down to the basement, grab a record, right? My dad and my aunts gave me their records. And so I like to go down to the basement, go and pull one from the shelf. And I like the whole process, like waiting for the needle to dry, it's a whole thing, right? And if there's always going to be some crown in the house. And so it's like pour 2 fingers, a little bit of ice, and let that be that, right? But it's that process of like, kind of settling into the space like the needle into the groove, right? So there's that aspect of it. But also, I thought that this was going to be a book that was written in social environments. So I thought I was going to be taking notes at parties, right? I thought like my notes were going to be blurred because it don't take much for me to run hot. I thought my notes were going to get like all muddled because, I'm all sweaty, right? But since I couldn't do that, part of my research around like being with the album was hosting a Quiet Storm radio show a year ago. And so part of that was like, okay, how do we think about mood? How do I like take on the persona of a late night DJ, which is also the title of another Barnes piece. And so like finding another way to engage in a ritual of being with vinyl was really key to me. But there's also something so particular about how distributed Ernie Barnes's Sugar Shack painting is in Black cultural spaces, right? Like this is a piece, I have a dream of doing a different book that's a Black social history of this painting, not about the ways that it has shown up in museum special collections and art galleries, but the ways that it has inhabited the walls of dens, right? Of like aunts, uncles, and even sometimes parents, college dorm rooms as a print, right? The fact that it was on Good Times, the fact that it was the basis for Camp Lowe's Uptown Saturday Night, like that album cover, the fact that there are other versions, like this piece shows up over and over and over. It's Black famous, like the painting is Black famous. And increasingly, as I talk to folks about the Marvin Gaye album, someone will be like, yeah, I know I Want You. Someone will be like, yeah, the song, it hits. But when I show them the album cover, they're like, oh, I know that piece. And so to me, there's something about the way that, again, I feel like Marvin fails the possibilities of this piece, in part because so many people live with it so differently. And to me, I'm like, oh, what is that? What do we do with the fact that the album cover seems to have a level of black currency that Marvin Gaye still can't quite reach? There are other projects where he absolutely reaches and exceeds it, but on this one, not so much. And I love that aspect of it, right? The album at times makes Marvin work harder than he believes he needs to. So yeah, I get to like hang out with that kind of tension.
Well, I don't know, following up on that, I just like it. I like the idea of data sets. Like I like organized stuff. So the idea of it just being like a block of stuff, I find very appealing. And that I don't have to go outside it or around it. It's like someone else made that decision. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, great. So we have the final 2 questions are from the 2 Carls. Carl Wilson, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'm going to change my question if that's okay. Because coming out of what Derrais was just saying and a little bit what everybody was saying, I guess as a 33 1/3 author myself, I'd like curious, especially in this moment where things are, new series hybrids and branches are being founded and that kind of thing. As being part of the authors in this series, did you feel a pull to make arguments about how this does or the thing you were writing about does or doesn't relate to a canon or an idea of canon or an idea of what serious listeners ought to know, like all of those kinds of things that were kind of the initial premises of the series in some ways? I wonder, as particularly, people who are writing things that largely branch away from the Rolling Stone list version of the 33 1/3 series, just how you thought about that and whether you made efforts to speak to that or whether we're at a point where we just ignore that now. I'm just curious about all that.
I could speak quickly to that, I think, which is it's probably just another version of what I was saying before, in as much as the collection that I wrote about has become canonical for a community. And so, you know, it's never going to appear in any of those lists, but actually there's lots of music from outside the Anglo-American sphere that is never going to appear in those lists. And so I think I was just interested in what it meant for the community that it came from and the community of DJs that have kind of come along since then as this kind of canonical point. And it's precisely because it's that thing that is looked back on and is made reference to by all the DJs and in all the you know, certainly the more in-depth journalistic features have been on that scene. That is partly what makes it an album for me, you know, is that it's that kind of milestone. So I don't see it, I still think that canonicity is really important, but we may have to think about, you know, multiple communities with multiple canons.
I can jump in there because I think with Naná, what just utterly astonished me was the fact that he was able to, like on one hand, sometimes it felt like a project that was in line with the documentary 20 Feet from Stardom, right? Where it's a ubiquitous performer, but do you necessarily know their name? But then in other moments, there's part of it is an argument that he should be more canonical in Brazil. He is in a particular city in Brazil, but he's kind of a musician's musician, and he's respected by other musicians, but his distribution was never good enough in Brazil for him to, you know, blow wide open. And so in a sense, it was more a matter of seeing that he really did make a mark in, you know, in Arto Lindsay and Laurie Anderson's early 1980s New York. He, you know, you hear him when you listen to Os Mutantes and one of their biggest hits starts. So like he was there at the moment that Gilberto Gil was really like coming together with his ideas for Tropicalia. So there he has this relationship to multiple Brazilian canons, although he wasn't central, but he has a connection to them. And then he was the go-to percussionist for a really important moment of ECM records, right, in the late 70s and early 80s. And just the fact that it was one person who lived on 3 continents and did this, and to say nothing of when he went back to Brazil at the end of his life, he made a huge impact on the new Recife scene of the 90s and 2000s. So it was more the aggregate of making a mark, even if you're not central to any of those canons.
I can speak kind of briefly to this, just the idea of opera. I mean, there are great places to go and learn about opera and think about opera, and that this book is not one of them. So it's a way to think about opera, but it's not about opera history, which I say at the beginning of the book, because it's, you know, it's like a 400-year-old art form that's gone through many permutations and styles, and there's a whole level of scholarship there. However, I think if one thing I deal with in the book is, and I'm going to riff on Robin James here, the idea of vibe. So instead of genre, this idea that they're kind of like an opera-y-ness that occupies a kind of cultural imagination. We have these ideas of how opera singers behave, what this could mean. And I think starting to think the breakup of the series, the way the 33 series is kind of exploding into different genres per se, could be also seen as evidence of this, and exploring about the idea of vibe. And I really like what Dan said about this interconnectivity you're exploring in your book, that there isn't that challenge ideas of genre, and yet the artist still retains a certain vibe. Like there's no way of actually subtracting Maria Callas. All that she means still comes back down in some ways to opera, an opera vibe. So I think if thinking about that as a way to recontextualize the 33 series in terms of genre is a pretty interesting one.
All right. So, Carl Miller, would you like to ask your final question?
Thanks, Kimberly. I know it's late in the game and my question was asked early on and it's kind of been answered, but I just want to ask a question based on the recent comments. First off, Dan, I just have to say I'm super excited to check out your book. Naná was I came across Naná as a guitar player as a teenager because he was with Pat Metheny, and he led me into all the different directions that you're talking about him going. And so he was a real guide to me in discovering new music. And so I'm so thrilled that you're writing that book, that you've written that book. But I was really struck by the kind of Derrais and Ginger's the ideas that the two of you talking at the same time has led me to, which is about kind of questions of professionalism, of training, and of the body, and of vocality and sexuality combined, and not wanting to separate those two to a certain extent. And I'm struck, one of the things that I would love to hear, and I don't know, we don't have time for it now, is kind of a detailed vocal pedagogy and analysis of Marvin Gaye and that tradition that is akin to the vocal analysis of opera singers that Ginger, you spelled out, was been going on for hundreds of years, the kind of pedagogy of the mechanics of singing. And also, the kind of experience of those vocal pedagogies in opera as being, and I don't know the right word, but as being embodied and physical and beyond the voice. I loved what you were saying, Ginger, about kind of beyond the voice itself. And so I think, man, I'm just really struck, and I'll just make a comment here because I'm loving this presentation. I'm just really struck by the synergy between y'all's two very different approaches to your projects. One being about creating a space for the body and for sexuality, and the other being about, in your limited comments, about technique and professionalism. And so I'm looking for someone to write a great pedagogy of, and maybe it's already happened, of the voice in relationship to both Marvin and Naná. And that's what I got, and I thank you all for your great presentations.
Yeah, thanks, Carl.
Carl, that's such a great question. I want to respond just for a minute and say, yes, please, Paris and Derrais, write that book. I want to reflect on one brief thing that I quoted that Grail Marcus talked about at PopCon a long time ago about the petrification of the gospel melisma, the idea of a sort of vocal affect signaling a kind of excess or of the singer breaking out of their formal traditions that then becomes petrified as a kind of habit. And I think when one thinks about that, and opera's full of these, Maria Callas is moving against them, but at the same time, you have a whole generation of singers copying Maria Callas, and these gestures that originally, it's the whole conundrum of performativity in any vocal genre, that as soon as you make something that is expressive of a certain kind of affect, it becomes ingrained in the practice and then loses its effectivity. So I think there'd be a way to talk about all of these vocal stylings and their cultural connectivity as being invented and stripped of that, and being reinvented and stripped of that. And this is a really, maybe we should all write a history of that, all four of us.
Yeah, I'll just say, Marvin is working hard, and he is meticulous in his vocal performativity. And so I think on both sides, the kind of, love it, Jim.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's I try to write about him at times as a failure, like he fails his own imagination. The technical ability is him reaching and reaching and reaching, and yet and still, right? Like he ain't quite doing it, right? It ain't quite curling up all the way, but I love that, right? But there's also something like so deeply damn queer about what Marvin is attempting at times. And so like another part of the Carol Phillips piece from his collection New World Order is talking about Marvin Gaye's relationship to sexuality, right? And I mean, and this is, so that's like part of what I'm trying to read with, right? It's what happens when I treat him as a failed icon, but thinking about him as a failed icon is also an entryway into hopefully fashioning another kind of listener of that album. Right. So like Ginger, like reading your work, engaging your work, and hearing you talk today, where like I'm thinking so much about creating another kind of listener. And it's like, yeah, the technical ability is there, but there's a porousness to it that I want us to be able to just kind of like slide into. Right. Like hopefully by the end of the book, we all in the damn waterbed.
Carl, this isn't exactly
that's great. Great, Joel. Oh, go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to say, this isn't exactly what you're asking for, but it strikes me that there are parts of Braxton Shelley's work analyzing gospel that get there, where he's talking about, like, instead of a truck driver modulation, it's an elevation modulation, and all of these very specific, with the voice as part of it.
Yeah, Sean Crawley's doing that, some similar stuff as well. So it's there, absolutely. But I was just struck by that kind of distinction here today. Really productive space, I think. You've excited me a lot, y'all.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That was a fantastic conversation.